Well, a little more than a year after Eric Garner's death, his family is still calling for justice. They want the federal government to step in. Mayor de Blasio, he said last week that reforms they have been made in the wake of that tragedy. Take a listen.
The whole police force is being retrained. We're moving forward on body cameras. The number of unconstitutional and unnecessary stops obviously is greatly reduced. And yet, at the same time, we continue to drive crime down.
I'm curious, from your perspective, Professor, being at John Jay, has a lot changed in the past year?
I think a lot changes each time we have an incident of this type of depth and, receiving so much national and international attention. And Amadou Diallo comes to mind, and you had the retraining of officers, you had different policies, you had them take other classes. So I think, yeah, a lot has changed, but it's difficult to regulate a person's heart. And the consequences have to be there. That hasn't changed. So there's change on the front end with the body cameras and the training, but is there enough change on the back end? Which means that if this happens again, what happens to that officer? Did we do enough in the criminal justice system process that that officer is actually going to face a criminal trial?
But it is the beginning of the change of culture within the NYPD, and that's where we have to start somewhere. And to the extent this mayor is talking about these issues day in, day out, is aggressively working on building links between communities and the people that are entrusted to police them, that's a good thing for everybody.
Well, 1 inch forward, but we were a foot in the ground. And that's the problem. I think a lot of people in the community feel that we had gone so far deep into the oppression of communities using stop and frisk tactics and other things like that, that this is good. And don't get me wrong, it's good. But there's a lot of work that has to be done beyond this. And hopefully this is not a 1 or 2 year process.
100% correct.
I had theory is too strong, but I had a question for you, and it really deals with the word respect, because we've heard that so much on both sides after various tragedies that have happened. I mean, I'm not talking about in South Carolina or some egregious stories, but where there is a situation in two different perspectives on what led up to the culmination of a tragedy. Now, the NYPD, specifically on the issue of respect here, they've talked about, within rank and file, about how to engage in conversations. And then on the flip side, you've also heard in the retraining, well, how about when police are encountering a situation, they're not getting respect on the other side of the side. So we've also heard from the commissioner that it's never been this bad here in terms of relationships between the two communities. So your perspective, because you got potential future cops in the classroom, even current cops in the classroom. I've always heard from officers that you have to, when you come upon the scene, immediately be in control of the situation. You have to show respect, but on the same end, you also have to make sure that the environment doesn't escalate into something else. You hear from a lot of officers, I'm sure they tell you even more than they tell us, back in the day, nobody used to talk back to the cops when the cops would talk to them, or let alone push back. What do they do when they're encountering a situation and they feel that they have to push back to get control? Conversely, the community says, I'm considered basically a criminal as soon as I'm pulled over, and I'm treated differently than somebody else because of the color of my skin. How much does respect and the perception of the lack thereof on both sides of it contribute to escalating situations like we've seen resulting in tragedy?
Well, two things. One, the community is supposed to do what the law commands when interacting with law enforcement. Respect is something human. Respect is not something that's supposed to automatically come from a civilian to an officer. Yet respect is supposed to come from an officer to a civilian. And that uneasy relationship is what we're dealing with now, where we have many officers who are saying, respect me, respect my badge, respect me as a human being. I want the same thing I'm giving you. But the relationships aren't even. And that's what I think people are missing. When an officer says, especially when you have leaders within the NYPD say, well, my officers are going to go home at night. That's our major focus, to go back home at night. They have the gun. So if a civilian says, well, I want to go home at night too, once again, the relationship does not have the same equal balance.
The very framing of that question suggests a balanced relationship when the police are there to serve. That is the nature of the relationship. It's not an equal
It's
situation.
not an equal relationship.
It's not. Let me finish the thought.
I
Let me
heard
finish
you.
the thought.
But that
No,
presumes
no.
the conversation. That presumes that from the police perspective, that they don't encounter a similar risk when they're going onto the scene. And then you've seen what obviously has happened in
I'm
other
saying
places.
that the risk is assumed when you put on the badge. It's not assumed when you walk out of the house in the morning. The dynamics are not the same. The relationships are not the same. It's not an equal risk situation. They are there to serve this community. That is the relationship.
I see what's on the side of the police car. I'm just trying to deal with the reality. I know it says to serve and protect, and that's great. I'm trying to say, what if all has to happen, and you are privy to more honest dialogues probably than the rest of us here, to prevent these escalations from happening when they seem so preventable in so many cases, but you hear in post-fact officers fearing for their lives and whatever else. It's easy to say this around a table here in a controlled environment. Now it's 97 degrees in Bed-Stuy, and you got two different people bringing two different things to the table. Are we going to be looking at more tragedy like this? Is it avoidable? What's the answer?
I want to say two things. And being an officer, and I'm not, I have people, and I saw a former student of mine today. I care deeply about what they do. And I say, hopefully, something I did in class will help you to treat me and mine better, because you're going to be in a position where you'll have the power over me or my family members or someone I care about. I want to know what you're thinking. I want to know that you understand the Constitution is the only thing that protects a person in that precinct. You have the weapons, you have the power. They're in the middle of the bowels of a police precinct. But I want you to also understand policing is not the most dangerous job in this country. So when it's 90 degrees outside, that roofer who's on the top of that roof has a more dangerous job than the police officer in Bed-Stuy. That's not taking anything away from wearing that badge. But if we keep saying every police officer has a target on their back, and then we're saying to black males, all black males have a target on their back, we've got these forces.
It's worse than that. It's more insidious than that. It's the framing of the question, I'm sorry, it's Bed-Stuy. It's 95
I'm
degrees.
trying to deal with the real world, Scott. I'm
just
trying
saying,
not to
Richard,
deal with some academic
No,
conversation.
and I'm just
trying
saying,
to deal
but that is the attitude that too many of our police officers who go home to other bedroom communities feel when they're walking into Bed-Stuy, that these are some alien communities. And one of the things that the Blasio administration is achieving is this sense that you're not in an alien community when you go and police these neighborhoods.
One of the things that you could do to improve the relationship, as somebody who's been around this for 30 years, and I'm not blaming police, they have a very difficult job, but when they roll on the scene, something so simple as identifying yourself, that's one of the biggest problems that I hear from communities of color. Dominic, they rolled on us. We didn't know they were 5-0 until they threw us on the wall, had us in cuffs, and then identified themselves. And so that's one of the problems. But Richard, one thing I just want to point out, we said that it's never been this bad. And see, that's
what the commissioner said.
Okay, well, but I have the benefit of history. In my opinion, it was much worse under Amadou Diallo. Every day, you got to remember, every day, black elected officials, Rudy Giuliani said, no, you've said something bad about me in the past, I'm not meeting with you. And they were lining up outside one police plaza each and every day, from David Dinkins to Charlie Ringel to C. Virginia Fields, and getting arrested in civil disobedience. So Amadou Diallo was much worse than Eric Garner. It's just, it's all relative.
I got less than a minute. I want to ask a policy question. You saw what happened out of Albany. They've now empowered the Attorney General to have his own prosecutor as it relates to police-related shootings with an unarmed victim. I certainly understand the sentiment after what we saw in Staten Island, but what would you say if you were the Brooklyn DA in the Akai Gurley case? And he says, time out. I was managed to secure an indictment. Why are you taking the authority out of a duly elected district attorney by his constituents to be able to carry out a prosecution? Why are you taking that power out and giving it to the state level? You have competing interests there. Which one's right?
Well, I'll tell you, you can look on Financial Times for the interview that I gave there. I said, this is a political choice you're making. So who knows the governor next who's going to be in office? Who knows the next attorney general who's going to be in office? When you start saying the law is going to be, we're going to use this third party, you could get a Ken Starr. You don't know who this independent
So
prosecutor
you'd rather
is going
trust
to
the local
be.
DA?
I would rather trust the local DA to a certain extent to bring the power down on that local DA, because with a grand jury, you don't have to have one bite at the apple. You can go back to a grand jury. We could reconvene a grand jury right now in the Eric Garner case. It's only the trial there's double jeopardy, not for a grand jury. And so this whole idea that we're not putting political pressure on these DAs to go back to these grand juries and try to get an indictment after all of the political brouhaha, I think that's the power, political power we're not using. I think right now we should try the independent prosecutor. We should try doing this way, but don't look for a miracle, especially when there's a political change.
Real quick.
Well, I was just going to say that it seems like we have cases in Ferguson where the DA doesn't want to prosecute, or in the Donovan prosecution of Eric Garner where we just don't know because it's hidden behind a firewall, so to speak. So having the special prosecutor come from the outside
You could
seems
also
like it
release
makes
the
some
grand
sense.
jury report. I mean, you could also get a window into how much they wanted to or
those
didn't.
jurors that it wasn't going to
But
be
you can
released,
protect
so-
the anonymity, but still release the report in terms of, finding out whether the DA actually did pursue an indictment or not, or he just threw out the whole kitchen sink, right?
Well, it also comes down to how the evidence is presented in that room. You could say, and this was the pen they say killed the person, or this pen killed that person. So on the transcript, the same words. So the zealousness of that prosecutor has to come through as well. There's a lot that goes on in that room that we don't get to see.
And Gloria, by the way, was waving that pen at Scott, not at me when she waved that. Coming up next, speaking of Mayor de Blasio, he's taking heat for traveling too much to raise his national profile. Now he's taking a hit in the polls. He takes a trip to the Vatican today. Will the trip hurt or help this mayor? We'll be back after this.